No one knocks at your door at midnight unless someone's dying. That's what Rhett Calder thought, the solitary cowboy of Winter Hollow, when he heard the banging. 3 knocks. No more. No less. Up here, in his cabin nestled in the mountains, the wind didn't usually bring visitors. Only memories. And him. 6 winters without lighting a single lamp, without speaking to a living soul. He almost thought he'd imagined it. But no. When he opened the door, the cold cut in like a knife, and with it came a little Apache girl, her dark eyes holding a look impossible to ignore. "Sir, my mama needs help. She can't breathe." She was 6 years old. The shawl around her shoulders was as thin as a whisper. Her breath came in bursts, but her voice didn't tremble. She didn't cry. She didn't beg. She just looked at him with that certainty only children who've seen too much can carry. And something in her, in that little one with snow on her lashes, lit a fire Rhett had believed long dead. It wasn't fear he felt. It was a calling, an opportunity, a chance at redemption. Without knowing why, he lit every lamp in the house, like a man blessing sacred ground. He wrapped the girl in his coat, grabbed his old storm lantern, and followed her out into the darkness. One tall, one small, 2 shadows crossing the snow. Outside, the wind howled like a wolf, but the cowboy wasn't walking away anymore. Now he was moving forward, toward something worth saving. The storm lantern cast a trembling light across the fresh snow, tracing a wavering path through the bare trees. The wind shoved hard from the north, but Rhett Calder didn't falter. He walked beside the little girl, Kaya, wrapped tight in his coat, her steps short but certain. His breath came in heavy clouds in the frozen air. "This way?" he asked, keeping his voice low. Kaya nodded. "Just past the bend in the river. Mama fell off the horse. She couldn't get up. She told me to run and not look back." No tears, just resolve. A kind of strength that didn't belong in such a small frame, but one that was stronger than the cold. Rhett followed her lead without question. Each step sank his boots deep into the snow, but still he moved forward. The open coat let in wind like blades, but he didn't stop. The cold didn't matter. Something stronger drove him now. A second chance. And he wasn't about to waste it. As they neared the riverbank, the murmur of water grew clearer, more urgent. The lantern caught something between the snow-laced bushes. A lump. A body. "There!" Kaya shouted, letting go of Rhett's arm and running the last few steps. Lying in a small clearing, half buried in snow, was an Apache woman. Motionless, save for the shallow spasms in her chest. Her dark hair was plastered to her cheeks, frozen stiff with ice. One hand, pale as bone, rested over her swollen belly. The horse, still saddled, scraped nervously at the ground, reins tangled in a branch. Rhett dropped to his knees beside her. He touched her gently, brushing snow from her face. Her skin was frozen, but life still clung there, weak and strained. "Noma," Kaya murmured, trembling for the first time. The woman opened her eyes for just a moment, long enough to see him. Then they shut again, a soft moan escaping her lips. Rhett's hand moved to her belly. Too firm. Too soon. It wasn't just the fall. It was labor, and it was going bad. "We can't stay here," he said aloud, as if daring anyone to argue. He took off Kaya's coat and wrapped it carefully around the woman's belly, then used his saddlebag strap to fasten it in place, tight enough to hold, but not to harm. Blood was already soaking through her skirt. The snow beneath was staining a dark red, pulsing with every breath. "You have to hold on. Do you hear me?" he said to the woman, though he didn't know if she could hear him. With both strength and care, he lifted her into his arms. Noma was all bone, muscle, and tension. She cried out once, but she didn't resist. Kaya ran alongside them, clutching her mother's frozen fingers with one hand, and Rhett's coat with the other. The return was brutal. The weight of the woman tore at his shoulders. The wind shoved them back, as if the world itself wanted to push them toward danger again. Kaya stumbled, but kept going without complaint. The lantern flickered in Rhett's grip, and he shielded the flame as though their entire lives depended on it. With every step, the ghosts returned. "You didn't make it in time, Rhett. You left them alone. You failed." But this time, he didn't answer them. He just walked. He kept going. He was not going to fail again. When the cabin finally appeared between the trees, its lamps still lit, Rhett nearly dropped to his knees from the rush of it. But he didn't. He tightened his hold on Noma, shoved the door open with his shoulder, and stepped inside. The warmth of the fire slowly came alive as he carefully laid the woman down on the old sofa near the hearth. Kaya knelt beside her, gently stroking her mother's forehead. "Will she be okay, Mr. Rhett?" she asked, her voice barely a thread. Rhett didn't answer right away. His hands were stained with blood. The floor was, too. The work was only beginning. The woman moaned. Her belly tightened again. Each spasm struck like thunder. The nearest doctor was more than 30 kilometers away. No one could arrive in time. And he was not going to let another family die in his hands. He looked at Noma's pale face. He looked at Kaya's pleading eyes. And then he made the decision. "We're going to get her through this, little one," he said, clenching his fists. "I don't give up. Not this time." And that night, Rhett Calder became something more than a widower again. He became a man who fights for life. Noma Redfeather's body weighed more than it seemed, not from size, but from fragility. Rhett Calder held her tight against his chest, arms rigid, while the snow lashed his face as if trying to force him back. Every step carried him farther from his past, and closer to something he still didn't know if he deserved. Kaya, steady as a reed by the river, walked beside him. Her small boots barely left tracks. With one hand, she held her mother's cold fingers. With the other, she gripped the edge of Rhett's coat. She didn't speak. She just clenched her teeth, focused on not falling, on not crying, on not failing. "We're close," he murmured, more to himself than to them. The lantern hung from his wrist, swinging with his stride. Its yellow light barely cut through the gale, but it was enough. A spark of hope in the middle of the white hell. At last, the house appeared, blurred between the trees. The porch was still lit. The lamps were still burning. That glow felt like a promise not yet broken. When they reached it, Rhett pushed the door open with his shoulder. All three entered. The cowboy, the child, the nearly unconscious mother. The warmth of the hearth, faint but real, welcomed them like an old friend. Rhett laid Noma on the worn leather couch beside the fire, now crackling with life. He covered her with a thick blanket, then turned. "Kaya, can you bring me that pot of water? It's next to the stove." The girl obeyed without a word. Her hands shook, but her feet didn't. When she returned, Rhett was already kneeling beside Noma, checking her pulse, pressing a hand to her belly. It wasn't just an early labor. It was a dangerous one. The tension in her abdomen was unnatural. The bleeding hadn't stopped. And the woman's eyes opened and closed as if she were trapped between this world and another. "You have to hold on," Rhett whispered, urgency overtaking tenderness. "Your daughter is here, and there's a life inside waiting to be born. Don't leave now. He steadied her gently. Noma's head tilted to the side. A low moan slipped from her throat. Rhett felt the old fear crawl up his spine. Not the fear of losing someone, the fear of failing again. He remembered Rose's face, his wife, on that frozen dawn 6 years ago. She had been bleeding too, shaking too, and he hadn't known what to do. She slipped away in his hands. Their daughter Lily didn't survive either. Since that day, he had promised himself one thing only: never again. Not this time, he murmured, and stood up with resolve. He took his coat and retied it around Noma's belly, reinforcing the pressure. Then he went to the corner where he kept Rose's things. There, among the clean linen cloths, he pulled out the one they once used for their daughter's birth. Dust. Memory. Pain. All of it came rushing back, but this time he didn't stop. Kaya had knelt beside her mother, holding her hand. "Is she going to die?" she asked, her voice low and hoarse. Rhett looked at her. The girl's face was smeared with snow, dirt, and tears that hadn't yet fallen. "Not if I can help it," he said, and that was a promise. The wind slammed against the windows. Outside, the world had become a white desert. Inside, the air was beginning to warm. Rhett threw more logs into the fire. Then he filled the basin with warm water, cleaned his hands, rolled up his sleeves, and prepared himself. He wasn't a doctor, not a midwife, just a scarred man who had chosen, for once, to stay and fight. "Kaya," he said without taking his eyes off Noma, "I need you to talk to her. Tell her something beautiful, something that gives her strength." The girl swallowed, leaned close to her mother's ear, and began speaking about a white horse with wings, about the day they swam together in the lake, about how her mother always hugged her when she was cold. Her voice was soft, but stronger than fear. And meanwhile, Rhett prepared. He took a deep breath. The heat of the fire clashed with the cold still buried in his bones. But his hands no longer trembled. That night, he wasn't just a cowboy. He was the last bridge between death and life. And he wasn't about to let the darkness win. The cabin creaked under the weight of the wind, as if it too were struggling to stay upright. Shadows danced along the walls in rhythm with the flickering fire, stretching and shrinking like memories that refused to fade. Noma Redfeather lay on the kitchen table, wrapped in rough blankets, her face pale and drenched in cold sweat. Her breathing was erratic, broken. Each contraction pulled a low, animal-like moan from her chest. Rhett Calder stayed by her side, on his knees, sleeves rolled up, knuckles white with tension. The fire beat heat into his back, yet he still felt cold. Not in the body, in his chest. "Breathe with me," he told her, leaning close. 1, 2, now let it go. Noma obeyed when she could, when the pain allowed. Her fingers dug into the edge of the table, searching for something solid to hold on to. At some point, her hand found Rhett's arm, and didn't let go. Blood stained the cloths he changed with quiet urgency. There was no time to think too much. Thinking was dangerous. Thinking led back to the past, and the past had already taken too much. Kaya sat by her mother's head, gripping her hand in both of hers. Her lips moved non-stop, not empty words, stories, memories, little anchors. "Do you remember, Mama, when we saw that deer by the lake? You said the spirits protect those who aren't afraid." The girl's voice was fragile but steady, like a thin thread refusing to snap. Rhett listened without looking. He knew that if he raised his eyes and saw the girl's face, he might falter. Another contraction tore through Noma's body. This time she screamed, a raw, powerless scream that vanished into the wooden walls. The sound cut through Rhett like a blade. For a moment he wasn't there. He was back in that other house, 6 winters ago. Same smell of blood, same tremble. Rose, pale, too much silence, and him, unable to stop the inevitable. He shut his eyes hard. "No," he whispered. "Not now." He forced himself to breathe, to look, to stay. "Listen to me, Noma," he said with a voice steadier than what he felt. "The baby's coming wrong, but it's still alive. I need you to trust me." Noma's eyes fluttered open, just barely. Dark, glassy. "The baby," she murmured. "If something goes wrong—" "No," he cut her off. "Nothing is going to go wrong. Not tonight." It wasn't certainty. It was a decision. The wind slammed harder against the glass, like the whole world was testing his resolve. Rhett threw more wood into the fire. The flames rose, casting an orange glow that filled the kitchen. Time became strange. It stretched and shrank between screams, gasps, and whispered commands. Rhett worked with steady hands, guided by instinct, by the memory of lessons learned through loss. "Not yet," he said. "Don't push now. Wait. Wait. Now." Noma obeyed when she could. When she couldn't, it was Kaya who pulled her back. "Mama, look at me," the girl said. "I'm right here. Don't leave." The bleeding worsened. Rhett clenched his jaw. He changed the cloths, adjusted the pressure. His arms were covered in red up to the elbows. Fear rose like a black tide, but he pushed it down, again and again. "You're not alone," he told Noma, pressing his forehead to hers. "I'm not letting go. I won't let go of either of you." Another contraction, stronger, longer. Noma arched her back and screamed with what little strength she had left. Kaya shut her eyes, but didn't let go of her mother's hand. "Push," Rhett said. "Now, with everything you've got." The scream filled the cabin. Then, silence. 1 second. 2. Rhett felt his heart stop. And then, the most powerful sound in the world pierced the air. A cry, loud, raw, alive. Rhett stood frozen, the newborn in his hands, trembling like he was the one just born. A girl, tiny, red, furious at the world. Kaya let out a choked sob. "She's crying," she whispered. Rhett didn't answer. He couldn't. His throat was tight, his eyes full. He gently wrapped the baby in the old blanket he'd kept for years, the one that had belonged to Lily. "She's alive," he finally said, voice breaking. "They're both alive." Noma let out a long breath, like she could finally rest. Her eyes closed, but her hand instinctively reached for her eldest daughter. And in the middle of wind, fire, and exhausted breathing, something shifted in that house. Not outside, inside. Because that night, in an old dim kitchen, Rhett Calder stopped being just a widower. And death, for the first time in a long time, didn't win. Morning came without spectacle, like a shy guest who didn't want to interrupt. It slipped through the foggy windows of the cabin, dragging a thread of golden light across the wooden floor. Outside, the storm had passed. But inside, the real battle had just ended. Rhett Calder sat on the floor, back against the wall, head bowed. His arms cradled the newborn girl, wrapped in a soft flannel blanket with faded pink edges. The same one he had saved for Lily, his lost daughter, and now it warmed another child. A new life born through screams, blood, and trembling. Noma Redfeather's body lay resting on the old sofa, still pale, still shivering, but alive. Her chest rose and fell slowly. She slept deeply, Her face turned toward the little one, now sleeping on her chest. Beside her, Kaya curled up like a worn-out pup, held her mother's hand even in sleep. Her dark hair spilled across her face, her lips slightly parted. The air smelled of ashes, of dried blood, and something more. Of home. Rhett didn't move. He just looked at the baby in his arms. Her eyelids drooped, but her breathing was steady. Tiny fingers opened and closed slowly, like they were exploring the world from the safety of a worn blanket. Gently, Rhett dipped a clean cloth into warm water and wiped the dried blood from his hands. The water in the basin turned red. He changed it in silence, without ceremony, then dried his fingers on an embroidered towel, a keepsake that had belonged to his wife. A hand-stitched rose still clung to one corner. "You came in the middle of the storm, little one," he murmured to the newborn. "And you didn't give up. You're stronger than you look." He stood slowly, bones creaking, back aching. He walked to the sofa and gently placed the baby on Noma's chest. The woman opened her eyes. Barely. It took her a moment to focus. "Is she all right?" she asked, voice a thin, trembling thread. Rhett nodded. "She's perfect." Emotion clouded Noma's eyes. A single tear slid across her temple, and with clumsy hands, she reached to hold her daughter. The warmth of that small body seemed to bring part of her soul back. Rhett stepped back in silence, giving them space. But before he did, he covered Noma's legs with another thick coat he'd taken from the old trunk. It had belonged to Rose, his wife. And he said nothing. There was no need. Minutes later, Kaya stirred. "Mama?" she whispered, alarmed. "I'm here, sweetheart," Noma replied. "We're all right." The girl ran to the sofa and wrapped her arms around them both, saying nothing more. Rhett watched from the corner. He didn't want to interrupt the moment. Afterward, he prepared something warm. Stale bread, a little honey, and boiled water in tin mugs. When it was ready, he brought the plate over and set it on the table. "It's not much," he said, "but it's warm." They ate slowly, with trembling hands, but hearts no longer so cold. The fire crackled gently. The air smelled of smoke, toasted bread, and relief. When they finished, Rhett bundled up, grabbed his hat, and stepped outside. The sky was clear, the first clean sky in days. The mountains sparkled under the fresh snow, and the frosted pines stood like silent temples. He crossed the yard to the edge of the field. There, between two large stones, stood the wooden markers, the graves of Rose and Lily, old, tilted by time, but firm. He knelt, took a white flower from his pocket, fragile, picked from the frost, and placed it at the base of one of the crosses. "I couldn't save you," he murmured, "but maybe saving them means there's still something good left in me." The wind touched the back of his neck. No longer a whip. Now a caress. And for the first time in years, the sun warmed his back. The morning sun brought more than light. It brought questions. It brought movement. And with it came watching eyes. Rhett Calder adjusted his hat as his horse stepped through the slush of the main road in Winter Hollow. The beast huffed wearily, but moved forward with steady steps. The saddlebags were full. Clean blankets, bandages, dried mint leaves, willow bark, a bottle of iodine tincture, and a few linen diapers offered in silence by the shopkeeper. When he entered the general store, the moment sliced the air like a knife. The bell above the door, the creak of the wooden floor, the silence. The stairs weren't direct, but there were plenty. A few men pretended to examine the shelves of canned goods. A woman stopped mid-sentence and lowered her voice. Rhett noticed it all, and said nothing. The shopkeeper handed him the cloth bag of supplies. He paid, left a few extra coins on the counter, and tipped his hat politely. But as he walked out, he heard the inevitable. "They say there's a woman in his house," someone whispered. "They say she showed up with an Apache girl, gave birth right there," added another. 6 years in the dark, and now he comes back with new blood. The words followed him to the door, like shadows. And outside the store, a more dangerous one waited. Jed Barlow. Rough, broad-shouldered, with a half-trimmed beard and a crooked smile. "Well, well, if it ain't good old Rhett Calder, the hermit's come back to life, huh?" Rhett didn't answer. Jed spat on the ground. "Funny how a widow just happens to show up at your place. Right on time to give birth, they say. And you, so, available." "It's none of your business," Rhett said calmly, not stopping. "Oh, but it is. This is a decent town, and folks look to example." Rhett climbed onto his horse. Before nudging it forward, he looked Jed straight in the eye. "You're only talking because you know she never wanted you." And with that, he rode off. Back at the cabin, Noma Redfeather sat in the rocking chair near the fire. The newborn slept against her chest, and Kaya clumsily folded cloths beside the table. When Rhett walked in, he didn't need to say a word. The tight set of his jaw, the flicker in his eyes, those told it all. "They're talking?" Noma asked, without raising her voice. He nodded. Jed was the first. The others follow him like hens behind the loudest rooster. Noma took a deep breath. She rose slowly and walked into the bedroom. When she returned, she was packing clothes into a travel sack. "I'm not raising my daughter under whispers," she said. "I won't let her be looked at like her birth was some kind of sin." "Then I'll go with you," Rhett said, "wherever you choose. But I won't let fear be the one making that choice for you." The silence that followed was thick, heavy, until a small voice cut through it from the doorway. Kaya stood there, fists clenched. "I heard them," she said firmly, almost defiant. "They're saying bad things about my mama, but they're not true. She's brave. She protected me, and she brought my sister into this world. And you, Mr. Rhett, you saved us both." None of the three moved, until Noma stepped forward and pulled her daughter into a tight embrace. Rhett watched them, eyes glistening with a kind of emotion he didn't know how to name. It wasn't sorrow. It was something deeper. Pride. Outside, snow still fell in soft flakes. But something inside the house had warmed by a degree. There was no more fear in the air, only certainty. The days that followed brought no rest. The cold still clawed at the windows, and though the snow came lighter, it continued to cover the roads like a quiet threat. But the heaviest thing wasn't the winter. It was the whispering that crept through the cracks. Words can't be seen, but they leave marks. And in a small town like Winter Hollow, words travel faster than wind. They said Noma Redfeather had settled in Rhett Calder's house without shame. They said the baby had no father, but sure had a lonely cowboy who'd do anything for a dusky-skinned woman. They said a lot of things, and few came from the heart. Some masked it as concern, others as morality. But deep down, it was the same old story. Fear of what's different. Fear of what can't be controlled. Rhett endured it in silence. Noma didn't. And that difference began to split something open. "I don't want my daughter growing up hearing her mama was a burden to a man," she said one afternoon, folding a blanket near the fire. Rhett looked up. He was at the table, sharpening the kitchen knife in slow, even strokes. "She wasn't a burden," he answered, without raising his voice. "She was a choice. Every step I've taken since that night. I took it with my eyes wide open." Noma stopped moving. "And you think that matters to the folks out there?" No, but it matters to me, and it'll matter to her when she's older. He was talking about the baby, sleeping in a wicker basket near the stove, wrapped in Lily's old blanket. Her quiet breathing seemed like the only pure thing in the middle of so much tension. That same day, while Rhett was stacking firewood on the porch, he heard footsteps in the snow. More than one. When he turned, there were at least 8 people standing in front of the cabin. Some neighbors, some familiar faces, some just curious. Among them, Mrs. Baker, 2 men from the blacksmith shop, the preacher's wife, and in the back, like a starving dog, Jed Barlow. "We just want to talk," said Mrs. Baker, with a smile that never reached her eyes. "This has gone on too long without some sort of explanation." Rhett narrowed his eyes. "Explanation? For what?" "For the example," another woman chimed in. "For what's being shown to the children. For how things look versus how they are. We're not here to judge, of course, but appearances matter." Behind the door, Kaya was listening, and before anyone could stop her, she flung it wide open and stepped outside. No coat, hair loose, her face lit with anger. "You don't know anything," she shouted. "My mom is brave. She fell off a horse and was bleeding, but she sent me to get help, and I found it. And that man," she pointed at Rhett, "he saved both our lives." Silence dropped like a stone. The adults and Rhett said nothing. Kaya breathed hard, fists clenched. Her cheeks were red, not just from the cold, but from the fury of a child who knew what injustice looked like. "Is that what you want to teach? That a mother who fights doesn't deserve respect? That if someone helps, it must be suspicious? Then what kind of town is this?" A woman in the back dropped her gaze. The blacksmith took off his hat. No one replied. Noma appeared at the door, pale but standing tall. She walked to her daughter and wrapped her arms around her from behind, steadying her without stopping her. The girl trembled, but she didn't cry. Rhett didn't move. He just watched, and though he didn't say it, that moment gave back something he hadn't realized he'd lost. The truth, spoken through a child's voice, was more powerful than any sermon. "Thank you," Noma whispered to her daughter, and without asking permission, they shut the door. Not with anger, with dignity. Outside, no one left right away, but the silence had changed. A silence that listens. After that day, no one came knocking again. And yet, something had shifted. The girl had spoken her truth, and though the townsfolk didn't apologize, didn't say it out loud, they showed it in other ways, with silences that weren't as sharp, with glances that, though still distant, no longer carried venom. Rhett Calder wasn't looking for apologies. He didn't need them. For him, one thing was clear. That woman and her daughters deserved better than what the world was willing to give them. And if the world wouldn't offer it, he'd build it with his own hands. The cabin roof hadn't held up well through the storm. The beams creaked with every gust, and a persistent drip fell near the stove, landing right next to the basket where the baby slept. Rhett said nothing. At dawn the next day, he pulled on his old work shirt, grabbed his hammer and nails, and climbed up onto the roof. For hours, he stripped away rotted shingles, lifted moldy boards, and replaced them with pieces he'd stored in the barn years ago. He hammered with a steady rhythm. Firm. Unhurried. Not out of urgency. Out of respect. From the window, Noma Redfeather watched him with the baby asleep on her chest. Her hands no longer trembled. Her eyes that once saw only danger, now saw a future. Kaya helped however she could. She swept with a broom nearly as big as she was, set the table with care, and even tried folding the napkins the way she remembered her mother used to when they still lived with her father. It wasn't perfect, but it was done with love. That night, supper was simple. Carrot stew, hard bread, and hot water steeped with a bay leaf. But the smell filled the kitchen in a way that words couldn't describe. It wasn't fancy food. It was home. It was real food. Hot. Deserved. When Rhett came in, tired and covered in sawdust, Noma had already set the table. She didn't say a word. Just handed him a bowl, gave a brief smile, and pointed to the chair across from her. That was her way of saying thank you. That was her way of saying this is yours, too. During dinner, no one spoke much. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire, the clink of spoons against tin bowls, and the soft hum of the baby's breathing. At one point, Rhett looked up and caught Kaya watching him. "What is it, little one?" he asked kindly. The girl shrugged. "I don't know. This," she said, then dropped her gaze. "This feels like home." Noma stopped chewing. Rhett swallowed slowly. They didn't say anything, but both smiled. Small. Intimate. Enough. Later that night, when everyone was heading to bed, Rhett went to the old trunk he hadn't opened in years. He did it with slow hands, almost ceremonious. Inside were the memories of a former life: a blouse carefully folded, a dried bundle of lavender, and a small wine-colored velvet pouch. He picked it up, walked to the kitchen, where Noma had just laid the baby in the woven cradle, and handed her the small object. "What is it?" she asked, puzzled. "A locket," he said. "Rose wore it the day we were married. I kept it all these years. Didn't know why. Now I do." Noma held it without opening it. She touched it like it was fragile. "I can't accept this," she whispered. "You can," he said firmly. "It's not for you. It's for the child. So she'll know there are things that pass from one life to another. Not by blood. By love." Noma didn't respond. She just nodded and tucked the locket away as if it carried more than metal, as if it carried a second chance. That night, for the first time in a long while, Rhett sat alone at the table with a steaming cup of tea and a silence that no longer weighed on him. He wrote a letter. Not to the law, not to God, but to Rose's parents, telling them that the world had changed. And finally, so had he. Spring didn't come all at once, not in Winter Hollow. Here, the cold didn't give up easy, but little by little the snow began to melt. First in the sunny corners of the field, then in the dirt near the stable. And one day, without warning, the first wildflowers pushed up between the stones. At Rhett Calder's cabin, things were blooming too, but not with petals or perfume. They were quieter, more real. Kaya no longer woke up afraid. Noma walked with more strength, her figure upright, her voice less guarded. The baby, still unnamed, as if the earth itself were shaping her name, had begun to laugh in bubbly sounds that filled the kitchen like wind chimes. And Rhett remained a man of few words. But everything he did, every board he nailed, every furrow he cleared with the hoe, was a silent act of commitment. One morning, Noma stepped out onto the porch with a bucket of soapy water and a bundle of small cloths. She sat on a low stool under the eaves and began rinsing the baby's diapers. The sun, still shy, filtered through the clouds. Her face was more sun-kissed, her gaze broader. From the field, Rhett watched her between strikes of the mallet. He was replacing fence stakes, strengthening posts the winter had bent. He watched her without calling out. She looked back, too. And in that wordless glance, there was something more intimate than a kiss. A promise without sound. That evening, Noma set the table with more care than usual. She polished the tin dishes until they gleamed like silver. She placed a wildflower in a small, empty jar at the center, and lit the lamp, not because they needed more light, but because the act meant something. When Rhett walked through the door, his boots caked in dried mud. He found her there by the table, waiting for him with a look that asked for no explanations. "Special occasion?" he asked, hanging up his hat. "I just wanted it to be nice," she replied. She didn't say it, but it was her way of saying, "This isn't an obligation. This is something I choose." Kaya sat in the middle, chattering about a cloud that looked like a horse and a rabbit she saw running near the chicken coop. Her words threaded the moment together with a child's ease, as if it had always been this way, as if this home had always existed. Not since the storm. Noma served the stew. The steam rose slowly, filling the room with the scent of bay leaf, onion, and carrot. Rhett helped himself to some bread, cutting it with his pocket knife the way he always had. But this time, when he passed the salt to Noma, their fingers touched, and neither pulled away. They looked at each other. And in that look, there was no debt, no pity, only affection, the kind that gets built nail by nail, day after day. That night, after dinner, Noma came out of the room holding a carefully folded bundle. She held it in her hands like someone holding a memory still breathing. It was Rhett's coat, the same one he had wrapped around Kaya the night of the storm. She stepped close and, without a word, placed it over his shoulders. "This coat saved my daughter," she said, voice steady but soft. "I'm keeping it. And the man who gave it, too." Rhett didn't move, not from surprise, but because nothing more was needed. He placed his hand over hers, right where the edge of the coat still rested. And in that gesture, something greater than a promise was sealed. Out on the porch, the lamp still hung lit, not from fear, from habit, from choice. Kaya was running among the brush, chasing fireflies with a stick in hand. The littlest girl slept, and the night, for the first time in years, was no longer an enemy. The sun dipped slowly over Winter Hollow, tinting the snow in amber, almost gold. The air was cold, but not as bitter as the days before. It was as if even the winter knew something was changing. Rhett Calder sat on the porch with a blanket over his shoulders, his fingers still numb from the day's work. Beside him, Noma Redfeather knitted in silence, her movements soft, almost ceremonial. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Inside the cabin, Kaya giggled as she gathered kindling by the hearth. Each sound of her laughter was like a little bell, gently shaking the corners of Rhett's heart. He'd never thought a child could teach him so much about hope. "She didn't cry today when she saw the dried blood on the floor," Noma said, without looking up from her stitching. Rhett nodded. "Because she understood that anything that bleeds can also heal." The Apache woman looked at him. Not like a woman looks at a stranger, but like someone who had crossed a river with you in full current and seen you swim with no strength but without giving up. "The little one asked if you're going to stay, Cowboy," Noma added, with a smile that wasn't teasing, just wise. He looked out over the field, where the bare trees rose like bones on the horizon. Silence wrapped around everything. "I'll stay," he said at last. "If you'll have me. Not as a guest, but as something more." Noma set down her weaving. She stood, walked over to him, and without asking, placed a hand on his chest. "A man's heart isn't measured by what he carries, Rhett, but by what he chooses not to let go." Inside, Kaya was singing something in Apache, a lullaby her mother had likely taught her, something about the moon and deer. Noma smiled gently. "My sister would have wanted you to raise the baby," she murmured. "And you, whether you know it or not, you've been raising her since the first day you chose not to run." Rhett closed his eyes for a moment. The wind blew soft, and for the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about leaving. That night, they shared cornbread, a warm stew, and the heat of glowing embers. Kaya fell asleep with her head on Noma's thigh, while Rhett worked on fixing one of the bench legs. "There are things you can't fix with nails," he said, eyeing the crack in the wood. "No," Noma agreed. "Some things only heal if you give them time and warmth." The moon rose slowly, high and clear. Snow crunched under his boots when he stepped outside. Rhett looked up at the vast sky, as if reading a map of what his life had been. Wandering, fractured, marked by choices. But now, there was a cabin. There was a little girl who slept without fear. And there was an Apache woman who, without vows or rings, had offered him a place to stay. "Is this what they call home?" he whispered to the air, like the wind might answer. There was no reply. But there didn't need to be, because the silence of Winter Hollow wasn't empty anymore. It was full. And you, who've followed every step of this journey, tell me, when was the last time you chose to stay? When every part of you wanted to run? If this story moved you, we invite you to join us in discovering more true tales of the Old West, stories that honor resilience, tenderness, and the spirit God placed in those who carved the path forward. Subscribe, share, leave your thoughts in the comments, and ride with us once more across this untamed land. Thank you.